Greetings, fellow Bloody Walkers. Guy here for These Bloody Streets. Today we're in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and we'll be exploring a very dark chapter in the long history of the oldest wooden courthouse in the United States. Built in 1749, the Plymouth County Courthouse was chartered by the Crown with a dual role to hear cases for the town of Plymouth and to serve as the seat of justice for the larger Plymouth County, which is over 1,000 square miles and encompasses multiple towns and cities. From 1749 through 1820, the court adjudicated both civil and criminal cases that were put before it by the town and the county. But today's exploration is less about the halls of justice and more about one horrible, tragic incident. Prior to the outbreak of America's War for Independence, Massachusetts was, perhaps, the loudest voice to argue that the colonies needed to free themselves from the yoke of British rule. Therefore, it almost seems natural that it was also the first colony to exchange volleys with the British. On April 19th of 1775, farmers from all over New England, and some from even further away, met the British in the towns of Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world was fired that day, signaling the first major hostilities of the American Revolution. Following that fateful day, Massachusetts had continued to staunchly support measures in the Continental Congress to expel the Brits. On March 17th of 1776, the combined New England militias and Continental Army succeeded in finally kicking King George III soldiers and supporters out of the colony. In the Continental Congress, Massachusetts continued to strongly advocate for putting increased military pressure on the British and to formally separate from the mother country. So it was no surprise that, in December of 1778, 105 men, mostly from Massachusetts, boarded the privateer brig, the General Arnold. Named for the famed American general, Benedict Arnold, the crew planned to sail under Captain James McGee to the West Indies to hunt for prizes flying the Union Jack. Many of the men joined up shortly before the voyage. Under normal circumstances, the officers would have entered these men's names into the rolls. However, McGee was anxious to set sail and reasoned that this could be accomplished while at sea. Ironically, Benedict Arnold was contemplating a betrayal of the American cause, while the men serving aboard the ship named for him were ready to risk their lives for American independence. After all, privateering was quite dangerous. Like pirates, privateers sailed on privately owned vessels. That's pretty much where the similarities end. Pirates generally sought to plunder vessels that may or may not have been hostile to the pirate's own country. Privateers, however, sailed under a letter of marque or permission from a recognized government to hunt for ships flying the flags of hostile nations. Therefore, pirate plunder was verboten, while privateers claimed a lawful right of plunder. Successful privateers reserved the right to an enemy nation's ships, but, in many cases, had to provide a kickback to the government that issued the letter of marque. Whereas captured pirates were often hanged and gibbeted, captured privateers, who produced their letter of marque, were usually treated as prisoners of war. This was because a letter of marque gave the privateer status as a sort of naval auxiliary. Of course, if no letter of marque could be produced, the privateer captain and crew could find themselves dangling from the hangman's noose. The General Arnold's crew had reasonably placed their faith in their captain, James McGee. McGee had emigrated from the seaside county Down in Ireland to Boston, Massachusetts, shortly before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. A year before taking the helm of the General Arnold, McGee had successfully captained other privateering vessels. Sailing against the British was incredibly risky. British sailors were well organized and followed orders compliantly. A failed attack against a British ship could result in serious injury, mutilation, or even death, but the General Arnold's crew were ready to face the odds and get their share of the plunder. Massachusetts winters are notoriously harsh. Shortly after sailing out of Boston Harbor, a blizzard struck. As a seasoned sea captain, McGee was confident he could navigate stormy waters. Tragically, he was wrong. As the storm continued to roll in, powerful waves battered the General Arnold. McGee charted a new course, the safe shores of Plymouth Harbor. The next morning, Christmas Day, the blizzard continued to rage. To avoid being broken up by the storm, the brig ventured to Gurnet Point, the entrance to Plymouth Bay, and set anchor. Frantically, the ship signaled for emergency help. Although Plymouth seamen wanted to mount a rescue, the heavy winds and waves brought by the blizzard were simply too strong to allow them to provide any assistance. All they could do was watch and pray that the storm passed quickly. McGee cautioned his men about sailing further into the bay. His maps didn't identify any hazards, so the General Arnold would simply have to remain anchored outside the bay and await help. That night, the situation went from bad to even worse. The storm intensified. High winds and large waves pushed the anchored ship to an area of the bay called White Flats, about a mile from Plymouth's shoreline. Cape Cod is known for its flats, or waterways that become shallow when the water recedes. Over the course of just a few hours, a waterway with a flat can go from a tide high enough for a ship to pass through safely to tide pools and sandbars capable of forcing a ship to run aground. High winds and waves caused the General Arnold to be pushed further onto the flats, trapping the ship. The storm continued to batter the vessel, which was sustaining more damage with each passing second. In an attempt to prevent the Arnold from being blown further onto the flats, McGee ordered his men to cut down the ship's masts, a task that took longer than expected, as a few rogue members of the crew stole some of the axes to bust open the ship's rum supply. To protect the crew from the storm, McGee and his officers ordered the panicked men below deck. He then sought to assure them that once the storm passed, Plymouth's seafaring community would come to the rescue. In the meantime, he rationed the remaining rum to each man, bizarrely advising them to pour it into their boots to keep them warm. The ship experienced its first casualty that day, a Marine captain. Within the next few days, more and more crew members would succumb to cold, thirst, or hunger. The dark angel of death lingered over the General Arnold. And so, for days, the crew waited and waited and waited. Luck was not on their side. Winds and waves started causing the ship to be pulled apart. The bay's icy waters began to seep in. If they weren't rescued soon, they'd die of hypothermia. As the crew struggled for survival, Plymouth townfolk brainstormed rescue plans. The waters proved too icy and choppy to successfully sail to the ship. That's when they devised an extremely clever plan. They began construction of ramps over which sleds could be dragged to rescue the trapped crew. Everyone knew time was running out. They'd have to move quickly. Members of the crew persuaded the captain to grant them permission to take the ship's only lifeboat, a small masted yawl, and brave the icy waters toward the shore. Without many other good options, McGee relented. The men navigated the small boat to a stretch of solid ice and then made their way safely to a moored schooner. They either didn't or couldn't send the sailboat back to the Arnold, thus dooming their fellow crewmen. That night, a glimmer of hope shone down on the trapped crew. The high waves seemed to recede. However, any celebrations were short-lived, as the winds caused the temperature to drop to sub-zero levels. On the morning of December 28th, the weather allowed for the men of Plymouth to attempt the rescue. They successfully reached the Arnold and began to bring the survivors over the ramps and back to shore. The rescuers were horrified by what they saw. Some of the crew were found frozen, clutching the ship's lines, or simply huddled together in a desperate attempt to gain even the minimalist amount of warmth. The General Arnold sailed out of Boston with 105 souls aboard. By the time the rescuers reached the ship, 70 of the sailors had perished. Over the next few days, 9 more crew members would die. The old burial ground, which Plymouth had used as a cemetery since the colony's founding in 1620, was far too frozen to allow for graves to be dug. The best alternative available was to stack the bodies in the old Plymouth Courthouse until the earth thawed. The cold of winter helped to preserve the corpses. Because so many members of the crew weren't entered into the ship's logs, their names are lost to the world. In late winter, the men were laid to rest in a mass grave on Burial Hill, mere steps away from the courthouse. The onlookers prayed for the souls of these unknown sailors. One survivor was James McGee. The ship's captain went on to a successful seafaring career, but he never forgot those who had served under him on the General Arnold. McGee generously provided support and assistance to the families of the lost men. When he died in 1801, he asked to be buried with his crew in the mass grave. But our tragic story has a poignant end. In the 1860s, a Maine man was visiting Plymouth, where he was told of the General Arnold's plight. He was so touched by the story that he opted to pay for an obelisk commemorating the crew. Even though the actual location of the burial spot was lost, the obelisk was erected at the top of Burial Hill. In 1820, a new town and county courthouse was built, and the Old Courthouse became a government office, housing the town's many departments. In the 1970s, the courthouse became a museum, which is still open to the public, where visitors can see artifacts from Plymouth's storied past. In 2019, the town of Plymouth approved an archaeological dig to find the mass grave containing the dead sailors. Perhaps we'll at last know the final resting spot of those men who lost their lives in the service of the patriot cause. To help celebrate Halloween, our favorite holiday at these bloody streets, we'll end this episode by discussing some of the strange occurrences that may relate to the lost crew. The old Plymouth courthouse is believed to be haunted by the spirits of the dead sailors. Throughout its years of service, multiple building employees described seeing apparitions or hearing the sound of ice thawing. Disembodied footsteps have been heard walking around on the courthouse's wooden floors, the same planks on which the deceased sailors were laid. Burial Hill, which has for centuries borne witness to death, is also believed to be haunted by multiple ghosts. Witnesses and paranormal investigators claim that the sailors' spirits haunt these grounds. Stories amass from people who believe they've seen the crewmen's ghosts aimlessly walking around, sometimes screaming, or sometimes simply pacing forlornly, perhaps hoping to make some semblance of sense of the tragedy that occurred on the General Arnold. So how about you? Do you believe the sailor spirits are still with us? Leave a comment and let us know. Now let's explore. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Thanks again.